In this Elden Ring video, we're going to be taking a look at the best 15 strength builds in Elden Ring. This is another video in our sort of series going through the builds that I have made in Elden Ring, and we'll also add some from Shadow of the Erdtree in this video because there are a couple good ones. But essentially going through, what are the good starter builds, how do they advance throughout the game, and what are good endgame strength builds. So if you've been wondering what those are and you kind of want to see a montage of some builds that you can choose and kind of how strength builds play in Elden Ring, then watch on for some useful information. So as always, we'll start at level 50 strength builds first, and the first one is the Champion. So the Champion playstyle is a very popular one, particularly early on in the game, before players have mastered a lot of the mechanics. But essentially the strategy here is to dual wield two great swords. You can find the Lord Sword's great sword and Claymore rather early on, but you can use any two great swords that you want that you can get early. And you're going to jump attack into enemies for very high damage and high stance damage. And this is going to give you good burst that can be further boosted by the Claw Talisman and Raptor's Black Feathers to further increase the damage that you do. And you can get even more damage by putting Golden Vow on one of your weapons and putting Determination on the other, or Royal Knight's Resolve, so that when you jump attack, you're doing even more damage. The next build is the Colossal Knight Build, and the Colossal Knight Build is essentially a build that uses the Great Sword, which is actually a colossal sword, but you could use any large heavy weapon if you want. The idea is to use this and Warcry, Ash of War on it, that will not only boost your damage, but will also change your charge heavy attack into a charging heavy attack that benefits from both the Axe Talisman and the Roar Medallion to further boost damage. Also, if you have the Highland Axe equipped in your offhand, that would further boost the damage of this. And essentially what you're going to do is buff yourself with this, and then you're going to use that charged heavy attack to deal huge damage to bosses and to stance break them very, very quickly. This is a really easy, cheesy bonk build that works really well early on in the game and can absolutely just smash bosses really, really quickly. It kind of gets less effective throughout the game as bosses get more advanced mechanics, hit harder, etc. And at some point you'll probably want to swap out of it. Up next is the Coldstorm Cleric Build. This is actually a build that is designed for all games, so this is very good throughout the whole course of the game. But what you need for this is the Chainlink Flail, which you can get very on. I know, Flail build. And you're going to want to pair it with any Great Shield that you can get early. The idea then is to slap the Stormcaller Ash of War on the Chainlink Flail and set it to the Cold Infusion, and then just spin to win on bosses, building up Frostbite and Hemorrhage as you spin, and also stacking up damage buffs that trigger from things like Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prothesis, or the Thorny Crack Tier, so you have very, very high damage, and you're ripping off huge chunks of health simultaneously from Frostbite and Hemorrhage. This is an absolutely deadly build in boss fights, and of course also lets you block counter using the Great Shield and Flail when you're out on the landscape, so it's very defensive as well. Next we have the Tower Knight, which is another all-game build that you can put together right away, and in this build we're using the Morning Star and the Manor Tower Shield, or any Tower Shield really, or Great Shield, in order to block counter, since hammers have fantastic stance damage on their block counters, and when buffed with Cragblade will do over 40 stance damage with each block counter, allowing you to stance break the vast majority of bosses in the game in two block counters, or a block counter and a charged heavy attack, since their charged heavy attacks also do over 40 stance damage when buffed with Cragblade. So the idea is to turtle behind your shield, get those block counters, stance break bosses, critically strike them and repeat, and occasionally trigger a blood loss with Morningstar. And then the last of our level 50 builds, technically another all-game build, is the Blue Baller build. This is a relatively new build that I put together using the Iron Ball weapon. If you were really min-maxing this build, you would use Starfist, but I decided to use the Iron Ball since I'd already made a build using Starfist. The general concept with this build is to split your stats between Strength and Intelligence, and then buff your weapon or your Iron Balls with Scholar's Armament, which is what makes them look blue in the namesake of the build, and then proceed to use charged heavy attacks on enemies, which stance breaks them super fast, and these charged heavy attacks are extremely quick, making them very, very easy to use in boss fights. And if you have trouble pulling off your charged heavy attacks, you can use the Endure Ash of War on here to give yourself a lot of poise, so you can poise through attacks and continue to get those charged heavies off, get a critical strike, and then repeat this process. Moving on to the level 100 builds, the first build we're going to take a look at is the Blasphemous Beastman Build. This is a build that uses the Clawmark Seal, Blasphemous Blade, and the Syncadia Dagger in order to not only have very high melee damage with the Blasphemous Blade, but also to be able to cast beast incantations effectively, since you're boosting them from both the Dagger and the Clawmark Seal. This means that you split your stats between Strength and Faith, which is great for the Blasphemous Blade, but also gives you higher incantation scaling when using the Clawmark Seal instead of favoring only Faith or only Strength using that seal. And you can also use things like Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength to further boost your damage, along with Beast incantations to have ranged attacks. So next is the Warrior of Waves build. This is a build that you can make relatively early on. I have it listed as an all-game build, but it's technically like a 3/4 of the way through the game build, since the Rune's Greatsword is not found until Redmane Castle, which is quite a ways into the game, and you actually have to defeat what can be considered a somewhat difficult boss for that early on in the game. The general strategy with this build is just having very, very high attack power with this weapon. It has one of the highest attack powers for Colossal Swords in the game. It does have decent guard boost as well, so you can block counter with it. And using its weapon skill Wave of Destruction at range in order to hit enemies from far away while you're safe is kind of the name of the game here. And the last level 100 build we'll showcase is the Blazing Bushido build. This is a level 100 Samurai build that uses the Nagakiba and Great Bow, as well as the Finger Seal in order to buff itself with like Bloodflame Blade and Flame Grant Me Strength. And the idea here is to split your stats between Strength and Dexterity in order to get quality scaling on the Nagakiba, and also because the Great Bow has D&D scaling in Strength and Dexterity to get more damage out of it. However, you could go the Strength route here and just put more points in Strength and Dexterity. You'd have more melee damage and a little less range damage, but it would probably work out, just the same or better for you. So here you'll buff your weapon with Bloodflame Blade and attack in order to trigger bleeding because you have native bleed buildup on the Nagakiba, and then you'll use Rain of Arrows on difficult to kill enemies and, particularly large enemies to pick them off really quickly. So moving on to level 150 builds, first is the Royal Frost Knight build. This is a build that is an advancement of the Frost Knight build, which is more of an intelligence-focused build, but here this is more of a strength intelligence build. The reason for that is that we're using the Royal Greatsword, which has both decent strength and intelligence scaling, and we're also using a Great Shield for block counters that has high strength requirements. So the idea is to either use the Royal Greatsword and the shield, or the Clayman's Harpoon and the shield, depending on what situation you need, with Ice Spear on the Clayman's Harpoon for when you need a little bit of range, and then to use Wolf's Assault from the Royal Greatsword when you need some AoE. The explosion for this does tons of damage, particularly if you can land the attack itself, and it's just fantastic when you can land both attacks, and it also does Frostbite buildup, which is really nice. So next for 150 builds is the Blasphemous Herald build. This is kind of a combination of the Blasphemous Beastmaster build and the Herald build. So essentially what we've done here is we're dual wielding great swords with the Blasphemous Blade or the Gargoyle's Black Blade in our right hand. This allows us to have a fire damage or holy damage option, and then we'll use the Gargoyle's Greatsword in the left hand, either set to Sacred or Flame Art Infusion, depending on which sword we're pairing it with. You'll invest your stats in Strength and Faith and use the Clawmark Seal to cast as well, and you can use Raptor's Black Feathers and Claw Talisman to further boost jump attack damage. So you're going to be able to jump attack, cast spells, and you'll have some fantastic Ashes of War on Blasphemous Blade and Gargoyle's Black Blade. And then lastly, for 150 builds, we have the Eochaid Executioner build. This is an absolutely devastating build that uses the Marais Executioner Sword or Regalia of Eochaid, depending on which you want. One is a great sword, one is a long sword, straight sword. So you can use either of those you want. We're pairing it with a shield for block counters. But essentially what we're doing is leaning into the weapon skill Eochaid's Dancing Blade. And what this weapon skill does is it spins very, very quickly in a corkscrew, hitting repeatedly, that you can also charge up for more damage. So we're using things like Rottenwing Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prothesis, Shard of Alexander, Godfrey Icon to get the most out of that, and you can often hit for 6,000-7,000 damage if you can hit with all spins. This thing is an absolute boss melter, so you want to get in the habit of charging it when you can. So moving on to level 150 plus builds, these are the last builds we'll showcase. These builds are meant for New Game Plus or the DLC, where your character has probably already finished a playthrough and is either going into another playthrough or continuing on into Shadow of the Erdtree. So first up is the Crucible Knight build. This is a build that uses Ordovis's Greatsword and the Clawmark Seal in order to lean into Ordovis's Vortex. This is a fantastic Ash of War that not only deals significant damage, but deals significant stance damage, has a lot of hyper armor, allowing you to use it through a lot of attacks. And since it's chargeable, you're going to be able to increase its damage with Shard of Alexander, Godfrey Icon. And since you will have some faith as well as strength, you'll be able to buff with Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, etc. And you can also cast aspects of the Crucible spells to kind of complete the cosplay along with the armor. The next build is the Starscourge build. This is a build that uses the Starscourge Greatsword, which is actually a paired Greatsword, which is great because it allows you to dual wield Greatswords without having to equip two, keeping your equip load down. So this allows us to lean into the moveset of dual greatswords for very high damage per swing, but also into the weapon skill, Starcaller Cry, which pulls enemies in and then follows up with a devastating AoE that basically kills most enemies in one use of this skill. Also has very high hyper armor, which allows you to use it through a lot of boss attacks, and it's really what makes this weapon so special in my opinion. If you're someone who likes to AoE a lot, you like to YOLO into groups of enemies, this is a great build for you. So the next build is actually a new one that I made like last week called Magma Spitter, and this build is a fire-based build that uses the Magma Blade and decent amount of strength in order to block counter using the one-eyed shield, and uses a combination of the weapon skills of that weapon and shield to deal very, very high fire damage. Magma Shower allows you to continuously drop magma on the ground while you hit the weapon skill, stacking up fire damage over time on enemies. And the one-eyed shield's weapon skill, Flame Spit, allows you to shoot a ball of fire from a good ways away, and if you unlock, you can actually arc it up for even further distance, giving you a fantastic ranged option that deals fantastic stance damage, and then be able to just stack up fire damage when enemies get close. This build is just extremely fun, and it's one of the most fun builds I've played. You can take advantage of some of the new DLC items to make it even more powerful, but you don't have to use them in order to play this build. And lastly, we come to the Stormblessed build, which is actually a DLC-focused build using the Mesmer Soldier's Spear and its unique R2 attack that pokes twice. It's not only unique to this weapon, there is another great spear in the game that does it as well. But this is one that can be fused with different Ashes of War, which allows us to put Royal Knight's Resolve on it and deal phenomenal damage when we do a charged heavy attack, because you can use Axe Talisman, because you can use the Spear Talisman, so if you deal counter damage while you're using it, you can get more damage. And it allows you to stance break bosses very, very easily, and to build up very high damaging hits at the same time. Easily one of the most devastating builds I've played so far, and it's very, very easy to use. So that wraps up my top 15 strength builds for Elden Ring. I'm sure there are other builds out there. There are definitely more strength builds in this game, but I wanted to showcase some of the builds that I have made and their effectiveness, and also kind of give you a progression. I know a lot of times people out there just show tons of endgame builds that you can't use at the beginning of the game, but I wanted to show some early game successful strength builds that you can use for a good distance of the game, as well as some that you might want to evolve into other builds and how they evolve throughout the game. As always, if you have further tips or maybe build suggestions for new players, please leave them in the comments below.